Am I even here? It is totally froze. Oh, this is fun.
Dang, I hear.
You hear me? You can't see me? Ah, Zoom's being all weird and stuff.
We've been thinking about the right way to acknowledge emotion, because that's always a problem. You know, there's this idea that you shouldn't suppress and ignore emotion, but then there also seems to be a problem with like over acknowledging emotion. That's something that's been on our mind, but I'm curious about what's been on your mind, dear friends.
Oh, I understand that.
Yes, that's it, Reed. Reed heard it. Yeah, Reed's all over it.
Very good, Reed. Very good. You know, it's funny because I've been meditating on this. Actually, you know, it's funny. So just a tangent, there's a bill what you're asking, Daniel. You know, that it is fascinating how much when we think of emotions as these figures inside a person, they're operating as a kind of self-regulational interface with external expectation. So what the accounts are, what I've read is that emotion is basically when there's a basically disfluency between external stimulation or a sensation to the external interaction with it, and that generates basically the presentation of a certain emotion. So, for example, actually, I wrote a note. Actually, I think it's from this group last week about envy, right? So that's actually a kind of mode of emotion, specifically about a kind of not having something of desired that you're perceiving from something on the outside. So again, it's that interfacing of some kind of disfluency of an external stimulus to the internal almost allocation of the body, right, of the emotional figure of the body. And basically that's what mental health is in a lot of ways. It's the mediation of those figures via emotion with external stimulus, and it basically in normative cultural dynamics. Obviously, you can't just kill someone. You basically can't strike someone with a head with a rock, for example, for being an envious state. We have to regulate it through socially normed positions. I mean, even just with children. You know, I was seeing some friends for Christmas, 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. They're very close in age. So obviously there's massive conflict over desired goods. Specifically, as a visiting honorary uncle, my attention. So every time I do something for one child, immediately, no matter if that kid is in the other side of the room or doing something else that has their attention, mimetic desire kicks immediately in, and they have to come in and demand basically the same thing at that exact moment. I see hands up, so I'm going to stop talking.
I can absolutely attest to toys that have not been played with for months appearing out of the bucket from a cousin who sits down nicely to play with it, and suddenly across the room you hear I was just about to play with that. I own it. Capitalism.
I am very familiar. Yes, it's a true attestment. I really am taken by this notion. I'll pass it to Philip and Michelle, of this idea of emotion as a kind of break. Emotion emerging in a kind of break between you and your external environment. It makes me think how Ebert kind of stresses how like consciousness kind of wants to be unconscious. It's constantly trying to like get to a kind of thoughtless state. And it's interesting to think that emotion is evidence of thoughtlessness breaking, perhaps, or that kind of conscious state of automatic activity, which in one sense suggests, oh, well, then we should get rid of emotion, because then we'll be automatic thinkers. But that sounds terrible. So it's interesting to think of emotion having some sort of testament to a kind of break, and the answer not being to just remove the existence of the break, because that sounds like lack, right? You know, how do you integrate with lack? How do you integrate with the break in a healthy and correct way without falling into lame, cheap therapeutic? See, that's always the issue, right? Like emotions are so interesting because there seems to be a very dangerous, like therapeutic kind of ethos, like therapeutism or whatever the word is, I can't say. But then at the other side of it, there seems to be the suppression, problematic relation to emotion. It is very interesting to think of emotion as doing something with a break, and the answer having to be somehow living or integrating with that break, just like lack. Those thoughts came to mind. I, again, attest to the existence of mimetic desire. It applies to food as well. Food they never wanted suddenly is the most delicious food ever. I really wanted that tuna. Reed, you have never wanted tuna in your life until Haven wanted, but I want it now. So Philip, Michelle, please. Philip, I love your glasses. They're amazing.
Oh, thank you very much. I think they're a product of capitalism. I think so much comes to mind, like first, like distinctions to be made between feelings and emotion. I know Antonio Damasio has done a lot of work on this in Descartes' Error. He wrote a book on Spinoza too that's pretty decent, but the idea is like maybe a response to the perception of a physical sensation, is more on what I understand emotions than just sort of like the super like wishy-washy, just things that like come up. You're like a little more maybe like in them. I'm also reminded of like Simone Weil talking about how different stimuli can send different people into affliction. So what happens to one person may cause like this great, either you're laughing or you're crying. And to someone else, it's kind of met with a stoicism. And I think Marcus Aurelius would say something like, have your mind constantly observing the emotions and kind of keep, he talks a lot about not moving your face like an actor, kind of keep a poker face. And there are like some memes out there nowadays. Like one I saw the other day was like, the ultimate flex is when your mind is stronger than your emotions and your boundaries are stronger than your empathy. And I think these are these ways that we create sort of, Jung would call it Joshua and Salome, these like distinctions between, this hard line between thinking and feeling. It doesn't really exist except from a certain vantage point. And then what becomes acceptable, like what you were asking originally, has so much to do with a being in time. Like what, I know Shakespeare wasn't like a perfectly accurate writer, but if someone, kind of what did he do? He like thumbed his nose at someone, and that kind of starts the drama of Romeo and Juliet. Do you thumb your nose at me, or whatever he was talking about in that. And like nowadays, that's not like grounds for murder. It might be the difference between like an honor and a dignity system that says in certain, like, if this thing is done, like, someone is going to act or respond with outrage, instead of being like, let me think about the other person. They're a human being with flaws too. Maybe they're having a tough day. Maybe they haven't been to Wawa's for a while. I should treat them with kindness, and push down all those things. So that's another just interesting overcoding of what Hegel calls, the Sittlichkeit der Sitte, the custom making machine of the customs. So what we've become accustomed to has very little to do probably with like the full spectrum of human emotions that we are feeling day in, day out, especially me, because I'm from the Midwest. So we don't really do the emotion thing.
No, I appreciate that comment very much. And it would be extremely awkward if like thumbing your thumb at people was still a bad thing, because my children do, thumbs up at me all the time. And for that to be grounds of murder would be a problem, like in Shakespeare. So I'm glad it's not Mr. Cadell Last. It's good to see you, sir. And it's very interesting. So this kind of idea of what is the right way to acknowledge emotion without it becoming sort of there's almost a way where you can say there's a difference between emotional intelligence and emotionalism. And there's always this concern of people being emotional in a sort of bad way that, say, destroys relationships or different things like that. But then there's also a not letting people express their emotions in a manner that then leads to all sorts of pathologies and different things. And I think everyone would agree that, like, that kind of Marcus Aurelius notion of how do you get your mind to observe your emotion, like your mind goes before your emotion. And that's an interesting distinction between emotion and feeling. I'll have to think of that. And then I'll pass it to Michelle here. On that kind of idea of how you get your mind kind of ahead of your emotion. Do you do that by always emoting what you're feeling? Or do you do that by some sort of level of repressing your emotions, but not to the point where it becomes, maybe there's a difference here between suppressing and repressing. And Mr. Andrew Lubert, is good to see you, sir. But it's very interesting because there's a question of how you get to that place
where you would be able to not be controlled by your emotions, so that you would actually be in the place where you are more full in your emotion, or you experience them in more of a life-giving way? So it's a very interesting question. Let me give it to Michelle. Michelle.
Well, hey guys, good to see you all. Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. I think about it a lot because, well, one, I feel like I tend to have like very big emotions, but also, you know, children are just constantly having emotions. You know, it's so many emotions all day long, and it's a lot to figure out how to be the mediator for them until they learn to mediate those emotions for themselves. And so I think my big thing is like, recently I've been thinking about the fact that, well, I think there's something about this. It's really important to realize that a lot of times we have a gut reaction to emotions or an emotional display. And the funny thing is that, like, here's what happens. Somebody gets frustrated, or child gets frustrated about something. Now you're frustrated that they're frustrated. And it's like this sort of, it's very difficult to slow down enough to realize that, like, okay, this person's getting frustrated about this thing. Should they or should they not? Well, let's just deal with what is happening. They are feeling that way, right? And so instead of exacerbate that by just mirroring it, you know, let me try to slow down and understand, well, what is causing that? Maybe what could be causing that for them? Or if you're feeling frustrated, what is causing that for me? Why am I feeling that way? I think there can be this kind of like, well, like if I feel frustrated or if I feel angry, I'm wrong, you know? And in a way, that can be the truth, but the reality is we do feel frustrated and angry sometimes. So how do we better cultivate a strength to handle those things? And I think that just the kind of the gut reaction of like, just stop being frustrated, stop being mad. Well, first of all, you're kind of mad while you say that, right? That's kind of a frustration that is causing that reactionary response. And so it's almost like having weights, and you're like, don't be frustrated. And the weights are sitting there. So you're like, oh, okay, I'll just walk away from those weights. Whereas this sort of acknowledgement of, okay, I do feel frustrated. And like, those are the weights are in this metaphor are like, what is causing this frustration? It's that heavy, that, because the feelings are always this kind of very visceral thing. Suddenly you've got like your blood pressure is rising, or so suddenly you're feeling like agitated. And so it's these things that maybe if we could learn to sort of like pick them up ourselves, not just lash out at somebody else, not just ignore it, but like actually just pick up the weights and start to get used to, what is this feeling? Why am I feeling? Get a grip on what is causing this. I wonder if that could cultivate the better strength to not always get frustrated and angry with all the little things. And I think there's a general debate where some people just say, well, just don't feel angry and don't feel frustrated. And you know, if you keep on acknowledging these feelings, then you're gonna just feed them, right? That's the one side. This is just me talking from like parenting perspectives, right? Then there's the other side where it's like, if you don't acknowledge those feelings, if you don't acknowledge what's happening, then like in a sports casting way with children, then you just don't equip them to know what to do with that, because it just keeps repeating. So generally, like, I see a validity in both. I see the validity of just, you know, kind of be better and don't do the thing. Don't get angry at this thing. It's not like that irritating. But that I also realize that may not cultivate the actual skill needed to learn how to not get irritated. And then, the other side of the acknowledging feelings, I do understand how that could be like, well, if you're always just like, oh, if the acknowledging being a potential incentivizing of that feeling, I understand how that's a risk potentially, but I do wonder if it's always about like using emotions as indicators. They're an indication of something that I need to potentially change, not what everybody else has to change for me to cater to my emotion. No, it's what do I need to change? Do I need to step outside? Do I need to, whatever it is. So that's a lot there, but I just generally feel like, I don't know why I always feel very stuck between this place of like, just toughen up basically, and which I do think there's a very real validity to, but does toughen up ever just become not picking up those weights? Just don't you know. So I hope that analogy like worked out well, but yeah, those are some thoughts.
No, I
Thanks.
think it's a massive question. I'll pass it to Luba and then Cadell.
Well, I mean, so for example, you can say as a father, if your kid starts screaming at the other kid, if you as a father just walk up and say, hey, Haven, you shouldn't do that, versus Haven, do not scream at your sister. There's a risk of, if you don't have stern enough of a reaction, that then they don't take you seriously. But then there's also the side of it on, aren't you getting angry just like them? So aren't you really basically doing the thing you're telling them not to do? This is a very tense, very difficult line to walk. And I think also, I do wonder, as we were speaking about outside, is if this is why like something like sports is so important, because there it's almost like on a playing field, you can start to learn emotions, and maybe you get really angry, but it's not at work, so you don't lose your job, or it's not at Thanksgiving. So it's like, I wonder if there's something about sports and emotional intelligence being tied together, or something like that. It's an interesting question. Let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Cadell. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. I hope you're well and you're going to Sheets, right? Because that's your favorite place.
Hell no, am I going to Sheets? Absolutely not. Never Sheets. But yeah, I think this is actually a very interesting conversation, or conversation topic. I think something that's something that's interesting to me is that when you're on a sports team and you're on the same team, it's like you both have the same goal in mind, and in that sense, emotionally speaking, you're both on the same emotional plane. Like you're more understanding of each other's emotions. In fact, you probably, just thinking of like football, you probably want the same emotional intensity with everyone on your team. So you kind of want that emotion present. So to me, there's something about the structure of a situation that matters. So like, if you structure a situation in terms of there's a clear right and wrong, what normally happens is there's the person that's either trying to calm the other person down, or trying to not be emotional and be logical, and in their being, in their behavior, in the attempt to be logical, they actually get emotional, like you guys are saying. And I think that if the situation is structured in a way where everybody participating in the situation is trying to achieve the same goal. So if people can acknowledge the same goal that they are trying to accomplish or trying to get across in the emotional situation, then I think everybody's emotions will be not satisfied, but permissible. And I think people wouldn't try to emotionally mitigate the other person. I feel like that type of exchange is only when the goals are not aligned, or there's a feeling that the goals are not aligned, and therefore the emotions aren't aligned. So I think there's something to how the actual emotional situation is structured that gives rise to how people are able to be emotional with each other in the first place. Yeah, I'll pass it off. Sorry.
That's very interesting. It makes me think of the idea that if a story doesn't, on your work, on the work, if a story does not have a theme, it cannot structure the emotions in a manner that does not actually just tear the story apart, or it fluctuates between comedy and tragedy and melancholia, so it actually doesn't work. It's very interesting to think that part of the issue with, say, daily life, whereas in sports, it's kind of clearer what emotion could do because it's toward a goal or not. And yeah, there might be some emotions that are better than others, but if it moves toward the goal versus not, that's okay. Whereas in daily life, not everyone necessarily has the same sense of the structure of the situation, which makes the emotional landscape more difficult. That is quite interesting. I will pass it on. Mr. Javier Rivera, good to see you. I'll have to see your recent Murakami work. I'm going to pass it to Cadell, Philip, and then Chetan. Cadell, good to see you today, sir.
Hey, good to be here. I just wanted to let everyone know that Andrew Tate has a really interesting tweet that he just released a really interesting tweet. So he's telling us something about how to live our lives on a daily basis. He says, You have to wake up, you have to go on your laptop, you have to lift weights simultaneously. You have to make about $300,000 before lunch and do 10,000 reps. Then you can take an ice cold water bath for 20 minutes if you've made 300K. Then you're supposed to work from 11 till 7, and you'll have your chefs making your meals for you by 8. Then you can go to a very fancy dinner, smoke cigars and shisha. Then you can go to a club and you can have many women who want you. But that gets boring apparently after a while. So then he said that's bullshit. And then he said he's going to become a hermit and make double 300K. So that's I just wanted to let everyone know that that's how we should be living our lives. Okay. So, I actually wanted to say, in relationship to what Michelle was talking about, in regards to this binary between, don't feel angry, don't feel frustrated versus acknowledging those feelings, and like sort of like the dialectic between those two. It's interesting, this dialectic. I actually noted that I had in the conversation I recently had with the Collins, Malcolm and Simone Collins, their perspective is never that there's no room for negative emotions. You're not allowed to have negative emotions. Don't acknowledge negative emotions, right? You just shut them out. And actually, Andrew Tate has kind of a similar philosophy. He believes depression is just made up. Like it's just like depression's not a real thing. So it's sort of like on that side of don't feel angry, don't feel frustrated. And then I think the other side of like sort of acknowledging those feelings and sort of getting sort of torn apart by those feelings. I mean, I think that's the other side. I think maybe Daniel, you were talking about that with emotionalism. But I liked what Michelle was pointing towards with emotions as indicators of what do I need to do to change. I think to me that's sort of where the emotions have to be brought to the level of speech, and you have to be willing to work through the contradictions of your own speech. But then when you're working through the contradictions of your own speech, it's necessary that you have someone that's capable of kind of holding you in that space. And I think a lot of the problems is that we don't have those spaces a lot of the times. Spaces where people can sort of hold us in that negativity or hold us in that contradiction. So it's yeah, I mean it's a tough one, but like to me, yeah, it's like how do we build spaces that are actually capable of withstanding the negativity of speech, where it's not negative emotions are not allowed. But it's also not sort of just the immediacy of your feelings are right, or something like that. So like at the end of the day, to me, it's like how can we build containers, and how can we be the type of people that can hold the negativity of speech for the other? And I think that it gets but I just want to say that for me. And this sort of maybe reveals my own selfishness, is that I'm only really capable of going to the very core of that for my partner. Like I can do that for my partner. I think it's a precondition for the relationship that I can do that for my partner. But it's hard for me to do that all the way outside of that container, so it's, I don't know. That's what I'm thinking about.
That was excellent, and I really appreciate you reading the Tate quote, because I feel like I know what to do with my life now. I was so
lost and astray, but now I'm found. So thank you, Andrew Tate. You've really set me straight. I thought it was about making 300K by dinner, but it's by lunch. That's what I was getting wrong. So thank you, Tate. I appreciate it. I'll pass it to Philip, Chiton, and Javier. But what you're saying is a big deal, because it makes me think how very often we've actually thought of emotion as kind of an individual thing, which kind of suggests that it's reified by a certain Enlightenment conception, anthropology. What if emotions are actually more of a communal matter, like it's more of a community topic? And we've too much thought about we've too much thought about emotions outside of kind of contexts or relational effects. Because like you're saying, a lot of this difference between working through emotion, acknowledging emotion, not repressing emotion, has a lot to do with both people in the situation, not just the one individual, like how they react, how you react to their reaction, how you can be understanding of the way that they're trying to understand you, but probably not entirely, but they're also trying, so you're not mad at them. But then you're also aware that you can't be like smothered by them. It's interesting to think of this as a communal problem. And maybe one of the reasons we struggle so much to have communal capital, social capital, and all these different things is because we haven't really dealt with, like you say, this negativity, the speaking of negativity, the dealing with negative emotions. In the past, communities may have just had to freaking get over it because I needed Fred to help me do the farm. I needed him to help me build the barn. So if he pissed me off, I still had to work through it. But now, when you're more able to sustain yourself without others, it's easier just to kind of walk away. Cadell, please.
Can I say just very quickly that to me also, like at least in my experience with opening up and being open to the spaces of handling negativity and discourse, is that usually you do end up coming upon, or you do risk the very real possibility of coming and stumbling upon a fundamental incompatibility.
Yeah.
Like you can find a fundamental incompatibility, which actually means that you guys got to go separate ways. Like that's happened to me. Like, and it's mega painful to encounter that incompatibility and to accept on both sides you found an incompatibility where the truth is you have to go separate ways. And maybe you come back together down the road or something, but there has to be everyone coming into one thing, into a harmonious whole, isn't always the truth. Sometimes the truth is you have to go separate ways. At least that's been my experience.
Oh, I completely agree. And look, it's not for bad reason that people can be hesitant to voice negativity. There's actually a wisdom
in not voicing negativity or just freely voicing negativity. But then there's also a problem in this, because if you never voice the negativity, you never test the strength. Like the community ends up it's actually very fragile, and you don't know it, or the business or the enterprise or the relationship or whatever. And there also is something here about, like you said with your partner, it's almost like that full reel of an individual can only be something that like one person, like we can only all handle one person in that capacity. And it would seem that might just be maybe a saint can handle two. I don't know. But it's like that. There's some wisdom in that. And so it's like that's a really real thing. And then to kind of figure out how everything falls along that is a big deal. And I'm now thinking, then I'll pass it to Philip Cheaton and Mr. Javier Rivera, because it's almost like we really have not dealt with the problem of negative emotion, I'll just say that, in a first world nation. Like first world nations particularly seem to really struggle because, again, like if my survival is dependent on others, we tend to kind of figure this out, or have to, or at least I can just shut my emotions down and not live with them because I'm so focused on the manual labor that ignoring my emotions is not so costly. Now, that's another thing I wonder.
Can I just say that in non-first world countries, there's also not really a space for women to speak about their negative emotions, and men do not hold women's speech in non-first world countries. And so first world countries are basic, and that's, I think, psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is about the negativity of women's speech. And can men hold that?
Oh, I completely agree. And what I'm wondering, and Emilio, good to see you, my friend. I'm wondering if, like in a third world nation or a more manual labor, if you don't voice the negativity, it's almost like it's more acceptable because you're not having as much free time by which the anxiety of those unvoiced emotions come to the surface because you have other tasks to focus on. And as you move toward a first world nation, the failure to voice negativity becomes more pronounced. You feel it more. You feel more and more that you have not dealt with that, which then means you have to learn to deal with that, and we have not learned to deal with that. I'm not sure, but that then gets into what we were saying, I guess, a few weeks ago on the strange reality that the birth of sociology and a lot of these kind of issues of anxiety tend to occur in about the 1830s when you start moving to industrial society, when you start actually having the problem of doubt and anxiety pulling people away, and they start forming tribes because they're actually meeting people on grounds of non-hierarchical arrangements. And they also have the time to meet one another in terms of just community as opposed to I'm meeting you to try to figure out how to raise a barn? It's a very interesting question. And certainly I don't mean to suggest that third world nations have some sort of enlightened emotional integration. It's the issue of, is that something that we've actually ignored that you can almost get away with ignoring until you get into more of a first world nation? And that's all of psychoanalysis as well, right? Those are the sort of things that you now have to deal with. And the issue of emotion seems to be kind of a area where this problem is extremely pronounced and unignorable, and you're now looking at it, and it's interesting to think of there being something communal, something multiple, something scene-based about emotion that we have not thought. But let me pass it to Philip Chichon and then Javier Rivera. Philip, please, you lost your glasses. You look so good in pink.
They'll be back. Yeah, I mean, it's all so good. I think the two things I want to touch on are first, the first 1,000 days of someone's life, and different people have different ideas of when that starts, are super important as far as the ability to regulate your emotions go. And it has a lot to do with the amount of anxiety the pregnant woman is feeling, environmental factors, like a lot of these things that we never see within those first 3-ish years are super important. And what we try and do is, instead of funding, people to be in good soil to grow during that time, is try and fix them afterwards in the medical apparatus. And it's usually based off of diagnoses thought through in the university, which is like this other, school. I think it was Montaigne who said it would be better if you taught kids to play tennis than like to go to school. And I think what he's actually talking about is this ability to learn about your emotions first. Very grossly put, to understand a little bit of critical thinking before critical theory is introduced, such that people can understand one key part of emotional regulation is pain tolerance. And we all have different abilities to tolerate pain. You might even just call it discomfort. But it seems to me like most of the physical discomfort, there's tons of people in chronic pain. I'm not going to say that. So most of what's happening is an equation of pain with bad, of pain with danger. So as far as like getting to a point where you can contain this negativity, it seems like a bit of a chicken and an egg problem of like, okay, until you can contain it, how do you have a container? So we get into like something like grace, or something like I don't know, luck, or just good education, an example, someone that shows you, when I saw a mouse run across the kitchen floor, mom always screamed bloody murder and shot it with an AK. And then I saw my uncle, and he just opened the back door and let it run out with, looking up from his newspaper. So it's this combination of both emotional regulation and then emotional education that I'm interested in.
That's very interesting, and I like the framing of the chicken and egg question of how do you contain without a container, and where does the container come from?
That's very interesting. Second, I really hope it's true that your mom shot a mouse with an AK, because that's amazing. And it is very interesting. Hey, look, Spolowski saying in his determined book about how women who have stress when they have a child in womb, that child has a less developed frontal cortex that's able to handle emotion due to the stress. Isn't that lovely? So the first 1,000 days, like you're saying, seem to have a big impact on it, or something, and that would get into different debates. And then, as you're saying with Montaigne, Plato seems to agree, because he's like, don't you dare introduce kids to like studies before they're 10. They should be playing and freaking wrestling until they're like 10. And Is a lot of the mental health problems, because it seems like this emotion question is connected to the mental health issue. Is a lot of that a result of removing playgrounds from schools or not letting kids go play? Plato and then different people would kind of suggest that there's something about that is necessary for learning levels of developing the container. Is play where you get the container? I'm not sure. Let me pass it to Chetan and Javier Rivera. Chetan, it's so good to see you. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well. You made a mistake by bringing this topic up. I've been thinking about these questions for some time, and now you would have to hear me out. It's a very tricky dimension to this problem of emotions, and I've been trying to sort of struggle with this question from the sort of split between subject and object, divide that comes across, and especially in psychoanalysis. And I think one of the first questions we need to ask here is that why any affect needs the mediation of emotions to assimilate in our consciousness. If you think about it, affect doesn't get assimilated in our consciousness without any sort of mediation with emotions in that sense. That is where I think emotions sort of, and why certain part of the trauma needs to be processed as affect. That there is this affectual dimension that is there because as part of our ego, we cannot process trauma without bringing certain part of the world that we experience as affect into our conscious thinking. And how do we think through that? What is the reason for the affect to emerge over there, such that we can process that part of things? I think these two questions sort of I've been trying to struggle with these questions because I've been trying to think about this problem from the lens of thinking that ego always rests on the side of object. Ego wants to objectify the world in that sense. There is this relationship in ego and object that we need to think about. And if we really ask this question in psychoanalysis, is a problem of confronting the ethics of the subject in some senses. Reclaiming what is left after the objectification has displayed. What is the residue that is left? What is that small part that can never be objectified at all points of time? And there is a subject that is always, and emotions in or affect in general always in some senses remains or can remain either on the side of the object or the subject, which is why it's a complex problem. It's never simply given to us that which is why it is important to in some senses sustain our emotions, as Cadell was saying, to inhabit them, to really experience what we are experiencing. So as Foucault sort of said it, to experience the part that remains unexperienced in our experience, and that demands a certain engagement with emotion. How do we think about that possibility, that potentiality that remains in our emotional life, while acknowledging that emotions fundamentally align to us, except probably anxiety, as Lacan would say it. Affect fundamentally actually is a layer that protects us, or that in some senses cushions us, and that helps us in some senses alter the world, that our contact with the world in some ways. But yet within this alteration, within this misrecognition, this fundamental deviation or alienation, there is a part that remains, through which we reclaim the split, the gap, or the lack back. What is it? What is it about that dimension in that sense? That is that misrecognition simply a case of a form of puzzle where you can recreate the original from that? I don't think so. It's that simple as that. There is no original there. Yet in that misrecognition, there is a possibility of form of an identification over there, which is fundamentally of a different texture, and I don't know. I'm open to thinking with all of you in that sense to see where this question would take us in that sense.
Well, that was lovely. And now I'm thinking about emotion as claim. Like when you emote, you're trying to kind of claim something or claim, or
like Mr. Jockin was saying is the beginning where emotion emerges as in the kind of the gap in this kind of split between the subjective and the world. It's like between the subject and the object, something opens up that then the subject through the effect is trying to process or to lay claim to that gap, to where they have some sort of say on it, or they have some sort of influence on it, or it's some sort of like, well, yes, this is happening, but this is how it is affecting me and how I have a say here, some sort of claim. And then also a means of trying to process that split. That's quite interesting. I really like what you just said. That's very interesting, because it's like there's, if you experience something that makes you angry and you get angry, there's a certain claim on how the world should be, or a certain claim on my say in the situation, or a certain sort of understanding of how this is affecting me. Could please, G time.
Just quickly, I just wanted to maybe say this, that I don't think we can actually encounter any object without this excess of affect, mediating it in that sense. And I think Milent Klein has a very interesting idea. She's sort of thinking of projection in a much broader way than Freud is, and she's sort of arguing that a large part of our own selves actually lives in others. If we make projection as a central form of thinking about, we realize that we do not live in ourselves most of the time. We are living in some sense in things around us. And Jung has this very famous saying that what irritates about others actually tells something about ourselves to us in that sense. That there is a certain part of this creation of objects, that always keeps on referring back to the something that cannot be assimilated in this objectification process. And emotions is a very interesting site to navigate touch that terrain for me in that sense. Yeah.
That was really interesting. And I'll pass it to Javier and Thomas Jockin, because now I'm thinking about
like how emotion is a testament against the Cartesian subject. Like the very fact that you feel emotion is evidence that the self exists in relation, and it's not by chance. Then perhaps Descartes is putting a lot of, now again, I'm not trying, Descartes is a lot smarter than a lot of the depictions of him, so I'm not trying to bash Descartes, but this kind of general conception of the isolated self, it's interesting to think that the emphasis there is on what? I think, therefore I am. It seems impossible to say I feel, therefore I am. That seems impossible. And so it's interesting where there's something about emotion that it's like, I feel, therefore we are. It almost has to have some kind of we that sneaks in there. That is a very interesting point. I will pass it to Javier Rivera and Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Javier Rivera, how are you, sir? Did you get through your exams and everything and survive? You look like you're alive.
Yeah, I survived. I survived.
Well done.
A very at-home topic for me. I'm going to try to depict it the way I currently understand it. As I grow older, I'm starting to see that there are certain wounds that the moment they are laid claim to, you realize that only further wounds the other. And once you realize that fully wounds the other, it also fully wounds yourself, because then you realize that you cannot lay claim to that wound, because by laying claim to that wound, you wound the other. So in some sense, it's inadvertently wounding you. And I think the most painful experience for me is realizing that there is no adequate person that can handle the wound to its fullest degree, because because expressing that wound to the fullest degree involves opening the wound of the other, which shoots back directly at you. And it's so painful because you literally feel like a child, like you feel frustrated, because it's like you're just like, like I can't say this because I know it will destroy them, right? And then you say it anyways, and then you realize that you've misunderstood them, and then misunderstood you. and you both destroy each other in that whole process. Because if it's based on a misunderstanding, if we are always saying what we don't mean and saying things that we don't really know what we're saying, it basically, it leaves myself with this question: where should it go? You know, where should it go? Because obviously the wound, I agree with Zizek, the wound is both simultaneously the sword and the wound. Like, it's both. Like, it is such a painful process that the moment you lay claim to your wound, it also becomes a sword that you're just slaying people with. And then you realize that they have wounds, and then when they tell you their wounds, you're just like being slain by that, because it's like, you're like, oh wow, I didn't know. And you know, it's like, it's such a compounding, visceral feeling. And yeah, I'm kind of left with that question, that fundamental question of like, I really believe there's a difference between, you know, supposedly forgetting the past and letting go, but it really looks pretty, you know, obscure when saying those words. Right? Because there does seem to be a kind of forgetting that is necessitated. But you know, that's I think that's the thing that we have to really discern for ourselves. Are we giving up, or are we letting go? Because those are two different things. And I feel like that's what it comes down to, at least for me. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
I really, really like that. And I think there is a difference. I'll pass it to Thomas, Joachim, and Emilio. And it's almost like,
you know, sometimes they'll say there's a difference between, you know, humility is not the absence of, say, power and strength, but the holding it back. You know, it's kind of the idea of, you know, Jordan Peterson talks all the time about, you know, being like the key is to have a strength that you hold back, right? But that's very interesting, because the difference between forgetting and letting go, it's almost like only you can know it. You know that difference, and no one else does. And if there is something about emotion that is communal, it's very interesting, because it would suggest that the individual responsibility for the communal emotion is being able to sense that difference and to let go versus forget, which probably errs on the side as well of repressing, right? And it also seems like you have to tell the difference between when you're speaking your negativity as a power versus speaking negativity for the sake of strengthening the relationship. And then this is maybe where the communal aspect comes in. The other person has to trust you. Like, that's like, the other person has to trust that when you speak your negativity, it's not as power, but because you believe in them, or there's some sort of belief in something here that's going on. And it's very interesting, because that's where you see there a kind of balance between individual, dare I say, sacrifice or discernment for the sake of the other, that the other then trusts, and this kind of going back and forth that seems to be this complicated dynamic necessary for community and relationships to occur. Last thing I'll say, I'm also interested on this idea of what you were saying on wound. You know, maybe I'm not holding to this. I'm almost just as a passing thought, it's like, you know, maybe what lack is to thought, wound is to emotion. And it's like being nothing lack, maybe like being nothing wound. And there's something about the wound that is the emotional experience of lack, perhaps. And, you know, that kind of comes to mind. And then it's like, it's almost like in the same way Dante describes beauty as something you gradually have to be able to handle, gradually following Beatrice. It's almost like the wounds of other people are similar things. Like, we have to like a relationship is a process of being able to handle more of the wound of the other. And maybe there's only one person in your life that you could dedicate the amount of time by living with them, ergo your partner, to get the fullness of a wound, simply because there's no other way than the amount of literal time that you'd have to be around them. And there's like only one person or a very small number of people that you could give that amount of time, not because you're finite, basically, that would then lead you to more of the wound than less. So maybe there's a bit of that. But then it's almost like handling the wound is something like Dante describing handling beauty. Again, if Dante sees too much of God at once, he dies. Likewise, if we see too much of the wound at once, we die. But then if you don't see any of the wound, there's no relationship. If you see no God at all, then you can't find God. That's always the trick with God's hiddenness, the balance between too much of God that overwhelms you and too little of God that you can't find him. Likewise, there's almost something here about the wound. Too little of the wound and there's no real relationship. Too much of the wound before you're ready and you're overwhelmed. And a relationship is then a process of handling the wound, because that wound is the reality. That wound is the place. It's that kind of break. Like I was listening to Mr. Murphy on the St. John of the Cross of Lacanum with that Cadell did that talk. And he was talking about the lack, the kind of gap as the space where grace enters, right? Like that break is where the grace enters. That's where the light happens. So you need the wound for the grace and the light to enter, but that's pretty difficult. And it's like an art form, like the art of, well, we talked about it last week, dwelling in pain, like Chetan and Jock and everyone, like dwelling in the pain and paying something to dwell in. It's very interesting. Let me pass it to Jockin and then Emilio. Mr. Jockin, please.
You know, it's funny. I was meditating on what we've circled back, what Chetan basically first brought up earlier this morning. You know, it's funny, right? Basically, it's kind of a colloquialism now, right? That everybody, basically your interactions with others is a mirror to you. Right, there's an expression about that. You hear in your age circles all the time. But I made a comment in the chat about it. You know, I was meditating on this point on what's called chiral bodies or chiral organizations or entities. What I mean, the usual example is left and right-handedness, right? To create a mirror, basically to create basically sameness between the two, you have to go into a mirrored higher dimension flip to convert basically the left hand to the right hand. There's also some interesting commentary about gender in that same exact discussion, right? Basically the inward and the outer, because the argument is made to say you can switch a left-handed glove to a right-handed glove by pulling it inside out, which is, again, a conversion to a higher dimension, basically higher dimensional space. I'm bringing this up because I talked about this last week. You know what's, so on this idea of woundedness, like, and I remember this with Javier, me and you, we had a little essay series, like a little discussion with each other. Part of the most damaging things we do to each other is we treat the other in the relationship, the most intimate one, as a self-reflection of ourselves. I bring that up because actually the most damaging parents do to their children is treat their children like a self-reflection of themselves. They impose their images and their phantasms onto that child, and then basically demand that of that child is basically to respond to those figures. And because the child has absolutely no defense against it in any way, those figures basically become the patterns for trauma, effectively. Because that's the problem with mental health. The fundamental point of what is mental health is having regulated figures in your mind to respond to reality. But almost all of us carry some trauma pattern, which is a discontinuity. You're not in reality. There's something parsing through your interaction with reality that is breaking. It's not, you're basically not getting the results performed that functions you want in life because of this misconsortment of the figures in your mind to the stimulus in front of you, even when it's objective, when it's not even based on truth or on reality. Because I think it was before someone else brought up about, right? A lot of times that discomfort from emotion is a perfectly fair point about pain. There are times like your body's telling you, dog, something's wrong. The problem is when it's a false alert and you're better off, and quite frankly, from a pure survival perspective, you're better off assuming it's a danger than it's not. Because the typical example is if you think that rock is a bear and you freak out and run away, you're going to be better off than you're ignoring it, and then you get killed by the bear. So we're dealing with biological evolutionary factors that are basically negativity bias, right? We're biased towards certain reactions because we need to survive. That's why we have them. Modern society obviously doesn't make that happen. That's not as true anymore. That's only because we're in an artifice that prevents that. I bring this up because, so in this discussion of children, right, with their parents, that dynamic, with the beloved, it's exactly the same problem. You're entered into a space where you have this chartal mirrored image, right, basically presented back to you. And you're almost all the time, as Javier's pointing out, you're just blasting through your wounds, your shitty figures and images onto this beloved. You're not even with that fucking person. You're with that goddamn image. I'm holding strong energy about this. I can't realize this morning. I was like, what have I done? I've destroyed these relationships and not even knowing. It's what I'm kind of drawing forth my essay, like my no discussion with Javier about this. Like, I didn't even realize what I was doing because I didn't even realize what I was interfacing with these fucking images. these goddamn images that was destroying and blocking from the actual relationship with this other, with this beloved. And there's real love there. The images are not all fake. They're not all false completely. But there's certainly something going on here that's not working, because whatever. Anyways, I'm bringing this up because this idea of the churro space of relationships, right? It's important because the idea of a higher dimension of relationship, I think it was brought before by teams, other pro-social entities that allow you into relationships to create goods and activities that you could not do by yourself, is the reason why we have to address this shit. You will not have the flourishing life by yourself. Even this argument of just basically, if we're making a claim that emotion is some sign of indication of this kind of co-communion with the other, just on that, we can go a little further on that point. I can build more on this point and point out there are activities and functions of your existence that will not be possible if you do not address this lack, you do not address these wounds, and you have to hold yourself in like this incredible, basically, contrition of just like, what have I done? I didn't even know what I was doing. And I completely shattered these relationships because they need to be because the problem is that, of course, the whole tension is that we enter these relationships because we need each other, but we're also terrified we're going to be destroyed by them. Just like, quite frankly, and this is why I'm bringing this parent-child dynamic, because as a child, you really are helpless. You really are. Beyond the physical helplessness of being a child, or really going on the first 1,000 days, for example, there's also just the emotional fact that, quite frankly, children, you cannot defend yourself spiritually, emotionally. You cannot do it for probably, God knows how long. You can make it. This is not my favorite expertise, but it's probably some length of time. It's seriously long. And let alone people that have codependent dynamics or anxious attachment problems, blah, blah, it just carries them the rest of their goddamn lives, unless they address it. So I'm just sitting here and going, it was asked before, I think I saw in the chat, like, what's the purpose of the container? The goal is there's certain functions of our cognition and just our activity of existence. We need each other. We absolutely do. We need each other to know who we are, like as we are, let alone the questions of like finding truth, finding out a good life, generating of children, social trust, God, et cetera, let alone the beautiful. I chatted, I put a thing on Instagram recently. I was meditating on this point this afternoon. Only the free taste the beautiful. That's it. Only the free. You will not approach beauty if you're not fucking free. And that's kind of building on the Lithuanian institute discussion about if you don't address the lack, you're not goddamn free. You're never going to be free until you address it. You can't approach the beautiful unless you're free. You're trapped by some other inordinate desires or anxieties or whatever. You can't be in the abiding of the beautiful, basically, if you can't address these points. So anyways, I'm very energized about this because I came to revelation. I'm convicting myself to my own errors and my own falsehoods in relationships. And God knows how I'm going to get out of this fucker, but so be it. I'm just sharing these points.
They're excellent points. And I think, one, there is something about the realization of the problem of images, to put it generally, that basically relationship is impossible without that realization. And then the realization that you never, ever, ever entirely get out of the problem. You see, like if I were to just speak of Christianity for a moment, there's always been the problem of going, oh, I know I'm a sinner. And actually knowing that you're a sinner, you start actually thinking you're not susceptible to the problem of sin. Like there's this kind of trick of knowledge there that you always have to go, wait a minute, hold on, everyone. Just because I know I'm a sinner doesn't mean I overcome the dynamics of sin. Actually, knowing I'm a sinner might be making it worse. Dang it. And so it's interesting, this problem of the image, and I'll pass it to Emilio and then Javier, because there's something about also, too, a relationship thriving when you know the other in the relationship is stuck in the problem of image of you, that you're an image to them, they're an image to you, and both people know that this is just something about the human condition that we can't get out of. We have to be an image to one another, but how do we fail better or die better or image, or have our images fail better in a way, knowing they're never capturing it, but also knowing that we require the failure of image to start moving toward an actual relationship. It's like you have to have understanding in Hegel to get to reason, which means you need something that fails in order to get to the thing that doesn't. This is where if you're afraid of error, you can't have truth. So there's also something as I was also just wondering as you were speaking, so often people talk about the gut.
you know, oh, their gut told them something. A lot of coaches or people would talk about that. I wonder if there's something about the gut that is more attuned with the relational dynamics, whereas the mind is more individual. Like it's an individual examination where intuition and emotional intelligence have some sort of attunement with otherness that the mind is not ready to capture in terms of understanding. Mr. Jockin, please.
Just to build on that, I'm going to be very clear. Like, the kind of like disgust, like the almost infuriation is that you're not going to get off easy by making this argument of the images and just say, well, fuck it, we're just a bunch of images with each other, we're false. No, the problem is every image is lacking. There's some point of truth, some mixture of reality to it. That's what's so frustrating about it. It's like you don't get the easy way out of abandonment. There's no way to get through this, or there's no hope. No, unfortunately there is, because there is some pointing to reality. Well, because what you just pointed out, there's some apprehension beyond the judgments and the reasonings that come after. There's a substance to things. There's a substance to things that we know. And our love for each other, that's the thing too, I didn't make a comment about it, but I said this of suppression and sublation. You know, love is basically transformation. That's its power. Its ultimate power is transformation. It could take the most horrendous evils of the world and just, regardless of your theological account, completely transform it by a one act in the end that can completely transform everything that came prior, no matter how evil, no matter how wounded, no matter how disgusting, and completely transform it. And it's something about, and those two aspects of it means we're not willing, you cannot, if you are honest with yourself, the demand on us means we cannot abandon this. There is no nihilistic skepticism. You cannot do it if you take this, in my opinion, if you take this seriously, what's being said right now.
I think it's very well put. I mean, to me, when Zizek noted like the notion of
you must tarry with the negative, that like that's tarry with the image. You can't just say, well, it's an image, therefore it's false. How wonderful would that be? But no, there is, like you say, it's mixed. Then that means there's some sort of skill, some sort of art, some sort of discernment that has to be worked through, that can only be worked through via the tarrying with the negative or tarrying with the problem. And then to pass it to Emilio, I do think like one of the reasons perhaps we've tried to locate the negative and not in the system. Oh, it's the system. Oh, it's the socioeconomics. Oh, once we have the right government, once we get back to the past, like these have all been ways that history has tried to deal with the problem of the negative as something that can be solved away. And this is the historic period, to make a kind of bold claim, where that plausible deniability is reaching an end, where now we have to see the negative as something we tarry with, lack as something we tarry with. But that tarrying is the possibility of a certain development of the subject. I think it's tied to beauty, like you said. There is something about the wound, the tarrying with the negative, the wound is the opening for beauty. But that kind of sucks. Like you have to walk through hell and purgatory to get to paradiso. But this is the human condition, and we're now kind of at the place where we identify that, as opposed to say, oh, if only we get the new system, communism, capitalism, whatever. It's so grounded in the problem of the art of tarrying with the image, with the negative, with the lack, etc. So, but let me give it to Emilio. Emilio, it is a pleasure to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back. To finally be able to come to one of these. Yeah, and always the conversation is really interesting, but also like very dense, like topics flying in and out. And I think like the main thing I keep coming back in this talk. I don't know how to refer it in a better way, but like to material conditions, in the sense that, for example, let's say that I had a trauma, right? Like, for example, let's say like, I don't know, my first girlfriend left me, and I've been traumatized ever since, right? For example, so like all my subsequent relationships are affected by that trauma. But let's say that I don't know, I could work through it. I went to therapy, I read books, I exercise, I don't know, and like some combination of these factors resolve the problem, right? And then I go, for example, into a car crash, and then I lose my memory, right, of like the last 3 months where I made all these things, right? These exercise therapies books. Like the question would be if I still operate, like if if the trauma still persists or it doesn't. And why do I mean why do I think it's relevant? Because like most of the time I think the mind is very busy thinking like all these theories of like subject object like wounds, and they're like really useful, but at the same time I've and not always, not definitely not always, but sometimes they just kind of go away, in the sense that, for example, like sometimes you're mad, you wake up and you're mad or you're angry and stuff, and you go throughout your day and it suddenly fades away, right? Like sometimes not you stay in that emotion, in that sense, but sometimes it just fades away. You I don't know, like at the end of the day you're like calm or like at peace or happy, even though at the start of the day you start like angry or stressed, and like you didn't like consciously do anything about it. It just kind of a process that happened in the background. And for me it's some of the most profound I don't know, like psychological things that I've solved, not solved, but like have but well, that are not an issue anymore, like just happen in the background. Like for example, let's say um like I don't know, like if something I don't like something is bothering me, like because I make this distinction like in a conceptual way, right? Like a relationship, a feeling of lack of like I want to do this but I can't, like an issue of that nature. And then you're constantly like thinking about it and working about it, but suddenly you go do something else, like you like the world pulls you out of your thoughts, of your intention, and then you play basketball with some friends, or you have to travel some place very far, and suddenly you look back a week and suddenly that thought is not as present anymore, and suddenly that issue that was like once tormented you isn't like doesn't you don't even think it about it anymore, but it's in retrospect. And I find that that's where I think like like the material conditions of in a way it's very obvious, right? Of course, if you're like hungry, you're going to be like more irritable, right? Like that's in a way it's really obvious, but in some sense, like for example, here I'm back in Cuernavaca in my parents' house, and this like I live in I don't know how to say it in English, in a condominium, like an assortment of houses that live together, and you have to leave that assortment and you go out to the streets, and then you can interact with the world and buy stuff, right? So you have to like physically go out. It's like a couple of minutes. I have to go like up a hill and stuff, so it's like that thing. And you would think that's negligible, right? It's like 2 minutes and like barely, not that much physical effort, but still that distance, I find that it has a profound psychological impact on the way I feel and do and interact with the world, which is really funny because in Mexico City, in the place where I live, you just I live in a small room, but you just walk out, you open the door, and you're in the streets, right? And there are vendors, and there's life, and there's people moving around, and I go this place or that place, or I can hop on like on public transport and transport and go anywhere. So even like my feeling of freedom and here it's the same, like I can go out and I can take like a public transport and or a taxi or an Uber or something, but like even like this very subtle distinction impacts the way like I feel way more free in Mexico City, because I have this immediate access, and like of course that shapes thoughts and stuff, and even like in ways that material conditions you wouldn't expect them to impact, because of course your hormones and stuff are material and affect your cognition, or that's of course, but like very like subtle things, like the way you live and the place you live, how much do you have to interact or go farther away. I think it's weird because, for example, let's say that someone is having, I don't know, like a heartache, like someone like broke your heart. It seems funny that maybe you don't need poems, you just need to I don't know, live in another city for a while, because that changes the way you interact with the world, and like the patterns, and like, but this all happens like unconsciously, right? Like, and I think most of the psychological problems get resolved in like like not by chance, but like in an indirect way. Like you're talking with your therapy, and sometimes you can have like a moment of epiphany, right? And oh, that was it, and you can act on it, and it's really really wonderful. But sometimes, like maybe you're talking your therapist for the 10th time, and the first issue you came up with, like it's not an issue anymore. But you don't like it. It gets slowly resolved in the background, and I think it's and and I think it's interesting in that way that how material conditions can shape so much of our cognition, our wounds. Like you just by changing something that's like really concrete, right? Really, really concrete, not abstract. And really concrete can have such an impact on the abstract. And that's not to say the abstract is not important, because of course it is, and it's also like it's a relationship, right? It also impacts the material. And yeah, and that space of probability, I think it's really interesting because, for example, as with the images and how you reflect on the other and all this, it I find it really interesting because most people, I like in my personal observation, when I have with my friends, with my neighbors, with my classmates, like the way they approach a relationship, it's in my point of view, it's really not weird, but they are not interesting in interfacing with the other person, right? Like they don't even think of the wounds that they have been. They are not interested in interacting in anything in a like deeper way to understand the person. It's mostly like it's an image, right? I want a partner. I want to have someone to have kids with. Like one of my classmates literally has like Tinder, and he has like optimized his profile for like 2 years, and now he has like a profile that gets a lot of responses of women, and he just like cycles through them. Like he goes like in the same day to 2-3 days with one, and then with another, and I'm like, there's nothing wrong with that, but he treats them like, I don't know, it's you don't interface with a person, you interface with the abstraction, right? With like the title, like you like, I don't know how to explain. You are not interested in the person behind it. You're just interested in the role they can fulfill, right? So you're not even going to like approach the wounds or like go deeper. You cannot even begin to start that because you are not approaching it in that way, right? And I think that's when a lot of the conceptual stuff really helps, because if you just know, right, that if you want to be like in a meaningful deep relationship with someone, like you're going to have to interface with that person. You have to interact with that person in some particular ways, and like if you know that it's going to be easy and there's bones involved, like you have a fighting chance, right, of it working out, of you like having that deep connection. But if you approach the relationship as like without because some people are like a convenience, right? Like they want the money or something, and that's like fine. They have their objective very clear. But if you actually want a relationship, but you don't realize that you're looking for a role instead of a person, it's going to be quite difficult, right? So I think that's when the abstract part is really useful, because that's like purely abstraction in a sense when you interact with another. But I also think that most, well, not I don't know if most, but like some problems that are conceptual have like very material solutions, and they just happen, and you don't have to think about them, and then just let like time pass, and it happens, and it think it's like a nice thing. But yeah, those are kind of the two thoughts. Maybe.
No, I think you said a bunch of wonderful things. I'll pass it to Javier. I think there is something to be said about the power of, and the Collins had a video about this, on the notion that some studies have shown the power of recontextualization, where, you know, when you can recontextualize certain things that were before traumatic, then they're not traumatic anymore. Where changing, and then there's also something to be said. I like to talk about the medium condition versus the material condition, or the architectural condition, where putting yourself in a different situation incubates a certain way of thinking within you. And you know, and so like the idea of going to a different city, having different stimuli that can change your emotions. It's also an interesting thought experiment on, if you were to lose all your memory, would you still have the same emotional resonance? And there is so, but you know, the question at what point is efforts of recontextualization efforts of repression? Like when you say, I'm going to try to recontextualize this so I don't have to face it.
So it's this weird thing because sometimes recontextualization is a wonderful strategy, or putting yourself in a different medium condition or architectural condition is a very smart thing to do. Like some people say, if you're sad, go lift weights. That can actually work. But then there are times where that does not work and it's naive. And so there's this interesting question of what's the difference between when recontextualization is wise and when is it an act of repression? And it seems like, can you tell? Well, are you able to tell? How do you have the ability to tell? Is that something you need others to help you think through? And then there's also something about kind of this idea. I'm also think a lot about when dealing with negativity, where there's a kind of art to indirectness, where when you create a new environment, what you're doing is dealing with the thing by indirectly approaching it, or kind of not dealing with it because it's too painful. So there's an art to indirectness. One of the values with philosophy is that you're able to, in a philosophical discussion, talk about personal problems without it being so direct that it's too painful. But that's actually wise, because then you gradually can move closer to it. But then, of course, you can also use philosophy to avoid it forever. So when do you sense that you're using indirectness as a strategy of getting more able to handle more of the wound, just like Dante gradually being able to handle more of God so he's not reduced to ash? And when are you using indirectness to avoid? When are you using philosophy to escape the concrete and the emotional, as opposed to using it as a way of thinking of new contextualization, indirectness to approach, and so on and so forth? It would seem as if perhaps these are the discernments only the individual can make to themselves, which is one of the things that you need thinking for. But we tend to use thinking not in service of these kind of emotional and arts of the subject, but to think of abstract problems that have nothing to do with the life of the subject. So maybe what we see here is something of where the role of thinking in this is to help us discern those subtle differences, and the emotions are the sign that a need for a subtle difference is present, that a situation is here that we feel that we need to discern about. And perhaps that's something about, like, I'll talk about the heart-mind myth, the idea that the heart and mind are split. That's a myth. They're never split. The mind informed, what the heart feels is what the mind tends to think about, and what the mind thinks tends to affect what we feel. And so maybe there's something about that relationship where thinking is in trying to discern, taste, sense these subtle distinctions that emotion presents to it somehow. I'm not sure, but let me pass it to Javier Rivera.
Man. So there is what I've been noticing, like spurious emotions. When does an emotion become spurious? In my own experience, it's usually captured by understanding that there is no end to this specific disturbance. What do I mean by that? So I can give an example. My partner and I, she's had a lot of past trauma as well. And one of the things that disturbed her the most was like that good people can do bad things. Good people can hurt you, right? So there's this inclination to want to promise that's not going to happen, right? But then there's this understanding that the future is just as unknowable as anything else, and we cannot guarantee that future. Now, we could get ourselves consumed about always wanting to guarantee that outcome, but to me, that's impossible. You can't guarantee that outcome. But then there's the other spuriousness of that nature where it's like, well, if you can't guarantee that outcome, then we might as well just not do it, right? We might as well just not be involved in this relationship, okay? So that's how you start to understand, in my opinion, the spurious nature of the sort of indirect references of like a spurious emotion of just like, I want to feel some type of security and promise. And then yet at the same time, I know it's not true. So where do I go? This is when we're left with trust. Like I have no choice, and we have no choice but to trust each other, to be willing to take that risk. Anyways, I trust the risk. I trust that I'm taking the risk, and I trust I decide to take it with my partner. That's all I can do. Everything else is spurious precisely because it would drive you insane. I have another example of where, you know, for example, like I encounter things where I like my mind is interpreting that somebody is referring to something and I'm convinced of it, right? But they are denying it incessantly, right? They are denying it. And so I have to come to either a couple of things. Either I admit that they're gaslighting the shit out of me, or which fundamentally doesn't give you any space for any relationship at all. Like it just doesn't, right? So it's either I take your word for it, or it's going to be a forever spurious nature, because basically skepticism can always run through its whole thing, and you can always find an opening to where it's like, yeah, but I'm not actually sure if they mean that, or I just think that they're placating me, or I just think that they're doing this. There's no end to that question. So either you do two things. Either you just say, okay, I trust you. I trust that you mean this when you say that, you don't mean that, and that's it. Or I continue on, basically fixated on that they're always saying what they don't mean. So it does seem like there has to be a sort of cap on it, and that cap, obviously, we have to discern for ourselves what that cap actually looks like. I cannot give you a formula for, okay, this is when you encounter a spurious question, you have to put a cap on it. I'm just saying, once you realize that it comes down to a fundamental negativity the whole time, and that this relation cannot exist without that negativity, then you just have to put a cap on it and be like, all right, well, it's either it dissipates or I trust you and we go on, right? Like that's it. There's just nothing else but this bare trust. And it's the same thing with like trying to prove trust. Trying to prove trust is itself the most spurious fucking adventure you could ever try to do, because you will never. And if you want to be a loyal cynic, cynicist, a cynic, you will find that you will trust no one, because it's just going to be a spurious venture the whole time. Yeah, I'll end there.
No, that's outstanding. I'll pass it to Mr. Luber and then Emilio. And what you say, Michelle, is a lovely paper where we
and belonging again on the notion of trust. And I just was going to say that one of the most destructive things we ever did is this notion that trust is earned. No, that's not trust. That's then a response to facticity. You don't have to trust someone that every single time does the thing that you see them doing. It's just like, okay, they always do the thing. So we've tried. Well, the issue is that the problem of trust is there's no way to deal with trust. And I do think ultimately everything basically does come down to trust. You only deal with trust by learning to live with anxiety. And we've created the idea of earning trust to avoid facing anxiety, because I don't have to face the vulnerability if I can just say, well, they didn't earn it, so I can get rid of them. Oh, and it's not my fault. It's their fault because they didn't earn it, so I'm safe. So if everything comes down to trust, everything comes down to living with anxiety, tearing with the negative, all of these other things. Oh, well, that sounds terrible. Well, yep, but that's the way. And we've created all of these mechanisms to deal with that problem. And it makes me think one of the worst things that ever happened to religion was the idea of faith as propositional knowledge, as opposed to something more like trust, something more like participation. Like actually the same with love. When love becomes, oh, I know they love me, versus love as a participation in the tearing of the negativity and the problems of images and the problems of trust and all these different things. Well, that's an issue. When love became when I know the person became a simile for I love the person, this was a huge problem, because love is a commitment to the mystery, if you will. It is a commitment to the anxiety and the unknown. So there are various language issues that have occurred, but let me pass it on to Mr. Luber, Emilio, and then Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Luber, please.
You just made me think about like an essential problem with there's the fact that you need the many to be yourself, but the actual like science, if you will, between those two, not, and I'm not talking about like sociologically. I'm talking about in terms of like a sense of friendship, a sense of love, like more I can't talk right now. Phenomenological. But as I sit here in my bathroom toilet, it makes me think that how is there a case where yes, you need trust and faith, but at a certain point, like let's say it's very easy to think of like Javier's situation. You're at a point of like 50, 60 years with someone where you've established that trust and faith. It seems like at that 60-year mark, like the trust is so strong that it becomes not a faith in itself. It becomes a fact. It's like literally you can like speak on propositional knowledge. So like in my mind, it's like I'm not a practicing Jewish person, but like it's like in the event that there's a Jewish person that's speaking about the Bible in like a factual way, there's like a certain sense of entitlement because it's like this faith has been practiced for so long. Like, how dare you? This is a fact. Like, so there's something where it's like you can't escape the temporal aspect of like if something in our like linear, so to speak, is just happening every time. It's like in our entire linear sequence, it's just repeating itself. Like even though it's not like propositionally true, like me holding this, protein shake, to me it just seems like it gets to the point where it becomes that. How do you deal with that? I don't know, but I think that's like something where it's like, oh, you can't really overcome that. It's more like you have to respond to that type of issue, and I don't know what the proper response be. I'm just honestly thinking about what you just said. But something that I took down, I think what Jochen was saying earlier about beauty was very interesting. It made me think of the question with regard to container. It's like, what is contained in the one and the many? Like in terms of a container, the container needs to be understood where it pertains to all different like containers in their context, so to speak. So the question is, what is like an ambivocal term that establishes what contains, in a sense? Because like the big problem with like how to understand a container is the fact that everyone's container is different. So I think that is like ultimately the challenge. That's why like for me, like the video with you and Daniel and the Lithuanian group, it was fantastic. But like I have smart friends. It took me a long time to get Lack. Like I didn't get it necessarily right away. But like I have smart friends. I like forced them to watch it. I thought it was unbelievable. And right. And they just like didn't get it. And we keep talking about it. Like they're about to read Lacan because they want to get it. They just haven't gotten it. It just makes me think that the presentation, how we understand how it's contained in the one and the many, needs to be in a way that's just very clear, where you don't necessarily need to get it immediately, but there's a certain terror in getting it. It seems like there's a certain like, this sounds very profound and true, and I think this is maybe regarding all profound truths in a certain sense, but there's a certain like fear, terror, and actually understanding it, and it's much easier to have a sense of it and repress it, almost like cognitive dissonance in a certain sense, where like you're just aware of it. So in that sense, it like satisfies whatever your desire is in terms of feeling like you're a well-grounded person. But I would just say that, I mean, for me, like the way to understand a container that contains the one and the many, so to speak, is theme. But that's just only if you're looking at it in terms of like an unfolding, like that your life is an unfolding. So that's only given if it's viewed at a certain way. So it's not necessarily true in my mind. It's only true if you look at it in a certain way. And I feel like that's honestly not fair. Like, it's not fair for you to have a way of thinking that it's like you got to look at it in a certain way to get it, and then everything will click. Like that, there's something. If something feels wrong about that, and to me, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, but I'll pass it off to whoever.
Oh, a few things. First off, for me, a lot of the idea of like what contains one and the many, we can look at the hip hop cipher. Traditionally, there's a notion of the dance. A dance contains the dancers, the one and the many, but it is also the dancers. They're contained in the it breaks apart. Theme you can associate with that kind of capital D dance as Dante or someone would. And there's frankly a notion that the only way to enter the dance is a certain processing. And to me, everything you're saying about the container problem is basically the question of spreading childhood and belonging again too. Is it possible to spread the conditions of which arise to the kind of individual that on average can handle anxiety, carry with the negative, and thus walk through Inferno Purgatorio and thus the freaking Paradiso? Because if not, the argument I would like to make is we will never solve the problem of demand in economics. Democracy is impossible and we're in trouble. So the problem of anxiety, So the problem of anxiety is at the heart of this, and the container is something like a dance or a hip hop cipher. There's different metaphors to use this. And the question is, how do you get it? What makes you get it? Yes, please, Mr. Luber.
So like, okay, you just made me think of something I forgot to say. In terms of the problem of anxiety, I think the primordial problem is the problem of death, finitude more so. So like, I think like, not that anxiety is wrong, it's just that at least for my own personal experience, when I try to work through anxiety, I'm more faced with just the fear of it ending ultimately, and like trying to understand death in my life. And yeah, I just think my question is, when people say the problem of anxiety, does that just include the problem of death? Is it just ipso facto? Yeah, that's also, you're talking about death, or are they separate? So it's more of a question because I'm slightly confused, but my apologies.
It's a great question. I'll pass it to Emilio, Mr. Jock, and then Cadell. I always like what Dostoevsky says in Demons or The Possessed, where he says it's actually not death that people are afraid of. It's the pain that they would feel in committing suicide. They're afraid of the pain on the way to death. And there's a question of, when we fear death, do we actually fear or the pain we feel thinking about death? Because death, if you're dead, you're not around to know you're dead, right? Ayn Rand kind of said that point. That's why she didn't fear death. But there is something about the pain of thinking about anxiety. So there's a question of, is it the fear of death, or is it a dislike of the pain experienced on thinking about death, or thinking about the pain led to death? I'm not saying it's an either or, but there's also something about pain that is in here that is inseparable from death. Because if you could think about death in terms of just pure facticity without any sort of pain that comes from it, there's a question of if one would fear it. And so Dostoevsky has some interesting thoughts on that. But let me pass it to Emilio and then Mr. Jock and then Cadell. Emilio, please.
Yeah. What I always think in terms of like when people handle anxiety and all this, I for the most part, I think that we as humans beings are very deterministic. Like, of course, like there exists like the space for free will, but I don't know how big it is because we are so very conditioned by everything else. So I always view us as like very effective, like. Not always that's the beauty, but like I think that it's as I'm saying it sounds a little bit I don't know if awful, but like if you like very mechanical in the sense that if you expose people to certain stimuli at certain points of their life, they will probably progress in a way that it's more emotionally or psychological healthy, in the sense, because, like, for example, like, now if you were being chased by lions, right? Like, you had, I don't know if your priority strict, but your view of life was very contained. Like, I can die tomorrow, right? So it's not as risky to expose myself to another one, because I might ever, like, I will die, right? So, like, if you, like, the risk reward equation is different, and since we're privileged in the sense that we lived in like, almost, well, or a majority of humans living in a way that they can live not chased by lions, that they can have like a semblance of like a regular occurring life. Like, I think hides a lot of these aspects about, like, maybe death, or a lot of other things. And because we have such like a comfortable life, in quote unquote, like, we don't get exposed to much stimuli to help us grapple with these emotions, right? Because that's why you can see like a lady, or like or a man in a man in a bar, or like a lady somewhere, and just like shouting and like losing their composure over such like a little thing, right? Like, and you're like, that's not proportional. But if you think of their life, that might be the most like painful thing they have experienced so far, which is weird to think about, right? So I think that, like, for example, for me, I think books are really cool. Not specifically the format, but like stories are really interesting, because in a way, like, within a story, like, people write the stories, and if they know or they don't, like, the stories have, because of the structure and how they are made, they provide meaning and they provide lessons, even if they are not a fable or something. And I think if people consumed more stories, like, they might be a little bit more prepared to this challenge. Because for example, when it was when Daniel said about like the anxiety of holding the anxiety, like, to trust someone, and that's like a painful thing, right? And if you don't have any reference for that, it's going to be difficult. But I just remember that one of my favorite series, there's a part, I'm not going, it's a slight spoiler, but I'm going to tell it without context, so it's not so I hope you forget if you ever read this book, that like there's this character that has committed like an atrocity. He was like this the general, and he was a general, and he like killed entire like kingdoms and stuff. But one of them, his most traumatic experience, is that he fought, and he was drunk most of the time, right? So he went to like the last kingdom, that because of the geography, it was hard to attack, etc. So he went to this last kingdom, and he set it on fire. But he didn't know at the time that his wife was inside the kingdom, right? So he inadvertently killed his own wife. So you can imagine like the psychological weight and heaviness of that thing. So he gets drunk and stuff. He goes to this, because it's a fiction book, he goes to this magical goddess and says like, please, I just want to forget, like, give me the ability to forget. So he forgets, and so he can go and live a semblance of normal life. But then, like, slowly, like, the memories start coming back, and even if they mention the name of his wife in conversation, you can't hear, like, he can hear it, he just hears a whisper, right? So but suddenly, like, the memories start coming back, and you can remember, like, remembering that pain is huge, and it's breaking, and he stopped drinking, he goes drinking again. And there's come this point, like, there's like, obviously, like, a lot of other things happening, but basically, like, there's a fight with a god, like a literally god of hate, like, that's the terminology. His name is Odium, and he wants this character to become his champion, to become like, I want to be like, you're my vessel, right? And he promises him, like, I'm going to take away your pain, right? Like, don't worry, you don't have to suffer anymore, I'm going to take away your pain. And like, in this like climax of his story arc, he's like, you cannot have my pain is mine, right? My pain is mine. And that's like his whole arc, and he, because of that, like, the god cannot destroy the city, etc. And you can see, like, in fiction, everything is like very very big, right? Like, there's gods and there's like this stuff, but you can, if someone reads that story, like, maybe, I don't know, but maybe they can translate it to the real life. Like my pain is mine, right? Like, even if I have anxiety, or like even if you wound me by opening myself up to this relationship, like my pain is mine and I can still handle it, right? And I think that's very beautiful, and like in story it sticks better. So I think if people read like books or consume this type of stories, they could be like more psychologically ready for when these things happen in their own life. And I think that yeah, if the material conditions didn't give you that opportunity, like if by consuming these types of stories you can have a good grasp, some tools to face this in real life. So I think that's an interesting way of helping people, like in general, have this psychological process, right? So I think that's really cool.
100%. I mean, Anne-Marie in the ILIC class was talking about that, basically, like literature is the road to empathy. And everything you're saying, I think it is very, 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 a society without story is going to really struggle with the problems of community and relationship because they don't have reference points. And that's a big deal. And I saw Mr. Luber smile because he agrees with you. And also, I'm very taken on this kind of notion of trying to forget. I think basically, to go back to Javier's distinction, since we have not actually figured out how to let go, we don't know the art of letting go. Most of what society is in the business of forgetting the pain, rather through drunkenness, distraction, atomization, doesn't matter. But basically what we see is today, strategies of forgetting are reaching an exhaustion point. We have to figure out how to let go. But then that goes to the question of, can you spread those conditions? What does that look for that Mr. Luber is getting at? And that keeps me up at night. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Cadell. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, yeah, when Amelia said about narrative and story, and I thought of Andrew immediately. I bring this up because, so Daniel, I've been talking to you privately that I'm reflecting on your on trust part and then belonging again, because there's notes I wanted to, so this is actually a fun opportunity to share some of my notes, just casually with it. You know, as you very clearly state, and Javier stated too, right? This earning trust dynamic doesn't work, right? It's as we discussed, it's a setup for basically failure, right? From the get-go. But no, but I'm thinking, it's funny we say this or we talk about this because isn't it not, I was thinking about this, isn't the whole operation of modernity, modern structures, not necessarily the earning of trust, but the suspension of disbelief? And that's actually very essential for narrative to work at all. So for example, in cinema, stories only work on us if we remove suspension of disbelief. That even if, and we have to grant it that suspension. So the suspension of disbelief is not necessarily the same as gaining trust. So that's a very interesting dynamic. I bring this up because, for example, and then multiple modes of operation. So for example, the structure of the corporation to exist, its entire purpose is to protect entrepreneurs, people, business owners, from harm, from risk, so that they can feel safe to do their entrepreneurial actions and know that the risks they're taking will basically harm this body, called a corporation, and not their body. They're not themselves, their prodigal self, right, of their material substance, either by financial structure and whatnot. Generally, we've concluded that that's a good thing. We've concluded that this kind of removal of risk by modes of suspension of disbelief via corporate structures, where basically, I think, in nature of relationships too, the kind of like, shall I say, middle-class bourgeois aesthetic of avoiding conflict and using mediated structures of protocols and norms to avoid conflict is basically a mode of like not willing to interface with each other directly. We're not willing to do it. We'd rather be in these kind of acts of suspension of disbelief about it. I said it's also because the idea of that basically people's personal lives are their business. Like your acts of who you love or how you treat your children are your business. It's a private affair. It has no bearing on the social space. But I think it's more people of other opinions, we shall say, would say, no, those things actually really matter. Those moral concerns are not just an abstractional thing to be abstracted away as we're going to suspend disbelief, basically, that my nature of trusting you is not dependent on your moral values or your religion or these other operations. Again, I'm not saying that these aren't good things, or we have not, as a society, conclude those are good, because the whole point is, if basically your religious orientation is something I need from you to earn your trust, we got problems in a pluralistic society. But if we enter a mode of suspicion of disbelief that your religious orientation has no bearing, we're going to abstain from discussing it. We're going to, which is a kind of not, shall I say, forgetting? I don't want to make that argument. My point, I'm kind of painting this picture to point out that this act of suspension of disbelief is not the same as faith. It is absolutely not. Like, because Daniel made a very powerful statement that love is the commitment to the mystery. This is something very different. This idea of honest signals, honest indicators of dosastic commitment, that your beliefs have a real substance to it, but you're willing to basically be wounded by it, right? This is a completely different orientation than the modernity argument of suspension of disbelief. I'm using this as kind of abstractional concept because we basically concluded that to engender people to take action, to interact with each other, we need to go into these modes of self-forgetting, of just kind of casting aside more and more of each other for the sake and taking risk, for the sake that we think that's worthwhile. But yet I'm kind of pointing out here that there's something about this that I don't have an answer to. It seems like in one energy, if we're talking about this need of dosastic commitment and honest signals of risk and taking on the commitment of mystery, which in this we're discussing here containers of emotion of the relationship, is willingness to enter into a space with someone. Because Amelia made a comment before, why not change your material context, right? To interact with things. But here's the problem. What happens when you're in a container with someone and the stressors come? The problem is these signals and patterns show up only under stress. That's where they show up, which cannot be controlled. They cannot be. Maybe mitigated, maybe channeled through exercise, nutrition. You know, there's different protocols you can do. But like, I mean, I see my friends with children. Like a 2-year-old on a fucking rampage at 4 a.m. in the morning. I'm sorry. I don't know about anyone else, but I was in a house where this is happening for Christmas. No, there's no running away from that. That stressor is on you, and it's so demanding on, quite frankly, Daniel's dying over here because he knows. Michelle, if his camera's not on, she knows too. Trust me, those trauma patterns are coming through, and they're going to be lashing out on that partner 100%. Guaranteed, nothing can be done about it. It's gonna happen. This is a very different mode, and I'm like, I mean, that's a different kind of relationship of commitment to someone, to that spouse, to that beloved. That is not a suspension of disbelief. There's something very different here. Because otherwise, the other way it would go, this is what Amelia, you pointed out, where your friend, who is the optimized Tinder profile. I wrote a comment in the thing about basically treating subjects as just fucking flows of data. It's just an optimized flow to get basically to treat someone as just some optimized object that basically you're going to suspend disbelief, which by the way, that's what it is. Because the fact that we're doing intimacy, one of the most important conjugal acts of sex, with quite frankly risk involved, and there is. No one likes to talk about that, but there is. Forget the pregnancy question, or that's one aspect of it. But even just diseases and all the other stuff, like those are there. But we seem to have just like a forgetfulness. We have this kind of suspension of disbelief. Nope. And we just carry on our lives like that, like as if like that. Notice that's what's required to allow this flow to even happen in the first place. So I'm just meditating on that point, right? So this is just casual notes for Daniel's essay on trust that I think is very powerful. And I don't have an answer because I do think there's like a tension going on here that the entire project of modernity is on this project of suspension of disbelief as how we're going to deal with things. We don't have to come to a resolution. We don't have to take risk. We don't have to like make a commitment to find an answer. No, we could just abstain. And that act of abstaining, that's how we're going to move forward in a polaristic society. And I don't think that's tenable. And I think in these discussions of the most intimate relationships, we're seeing that that's not going to work because stressors and patterns like this that are a necessity in the kind of, I keep using the word, the kind of that serial reflective mirror relationship of the intimate with yourself. It's not going to allow an act of suspension of disbelief. It's going to require something very different. It cannot be earned. It's not an earned trust. That's the point. It's something else. That's what I got.
That's excellent. The suspension of disbelief is not the same as the presence of belief.
And you have to, though, go through what Tocqueville would call doubt and disbelief in order to free yourself from closed-mindedness. But the very act of freeing yourself via doubt and disbelief is the very thing that leads you into the anxiety and not knowing what to do with that freedom. And so that's why, for me, I've been extremely interested in revisiting Tocqueville. Basically, to your point on the container, we were able to deal, most of history was able to deal with the problem of pluralism by getting on a ship and going somewhere different. Rather it be the pilgrims or the frontier, and under the pluralized, globalized world, we can't do that anymore. So we're stuck in the container. Now, there is something to be said about a wisdom of leaving containers or recontextualizing problematic situations that will not contribute to the processing of a wound to give you more access to beauty or to develop yourself as a subject that can integrate with lack. But you must eventually make an absolute choice. As we've talked about before at the net, you must choose your container wisely, but you must choose. So there's a balance here, and basically what you are now is in a world where we can no longer deal with difference by moving to different containers, even if there is something to be said about going through that period to get to the place where you're ready as a subject collectively and individually to make an absolute choice. The other thing, the last thing I'll say, I'll pass it to Cadell and then Javier. One of the things we try to do is, where love is a commitment to the mystery, one of the reasons we want to earn trust is because we want to assure that the mystery is a Dante beatific vision, not a Lovecraft creature. But in order for love to actually work, you have to be committed to the mystery, not knowing, but trusting. But the mystery must always have the risk of being Lovecraft, not guaranteed Dante. Screw that. But all right, well, then you're out, because that's what you have to. Commitment to the mystery has to be commitment to the Lovecraft, which then the key is the question of this. Are you ready if it's Lovecraft? Can you handle it? Because the revelation of Dante and my other favorite, Flannery O'Connor, is that the only way to the beatific vision is through Lovecraft, actually. You have to go through that. One of the worst things that ever happened to Christianity is by making Jesus all love, all sweet, and kind of forgetting the craziness of the Torah, of the kind of the notion of the divine as being a very strange place. The imagery of angels have become like pretty looking people in a lot of Christianity. When now I think it goes a little far with the Christus ornament skits where it's all just eyes with like wings and different things, because there are people looking angels. But the point is, the crazy imagery tends to get left behind. And that all is a major problem, because what you end up doing is you make the word mystery a simile for paradise. And that's when it's no longer a mystery. You actually know what it is. You call it a mystery, but it's actually functionally not a mystery. But that's terrifying, indeed. This is that we must, one must be committed to that in order to work through the place where love could be possible in a deepest way. Let me pass it to Cadell and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Cadell, please.
Okay, this is awesome. Okay. Do we need the Lovecraft creature to build Dante's beatific vision, or to go towards Dante's beatific vision? My current project is kind of like, my deepest current project is in like on the level of the unconscious for me. I have this idea of building the Cthulhu network. Like this is like my secret, like this is on my like my images that I love just playing with images before doing anything, and the image in my mind is the Cthulhu network, but like I'd have to go into like what, you know, where what that's derived from in my actual experience. But part of it is at the School of Thinking. At the end of my doctorate, we tried to start this program called the School of Thinking. And I had to leave the School of Thinking ultimately because I wanted the School of Thinking to be choose your container, and the School of Thinking wanted it to be a multiplicity of containers. Right? So I had to leave because, you know, basically it's postmodern multiplicity versus truth, basically. Like, and you know, they would, like, the people who started the School of Thinking, when you brought up Plato or truth, they would leave the table. You know, and I'm trying to also, you know, I don't know, it's very complex, but I wanted to ask a question for myself. I'm asking a question why am I buying Super Mario games? The last few weeks, I've been buying Super Mario games. I love Super Mario, right? Like, I bought the best, like, I love these games. This is a Mario Kart. You can't go wrong with Mario Kart. Super Mario Odyssey Anyway, I could go on. And Super Mario Wonder. I recommend these games, by the way. But I'm asking myself, why am I buying Mario games? Because, and my first is the Oedipal hypothesis, because Mario is a super Oedipal story. Like it's super Oedipal. Like the opening story of Super Mario Odyssey is like the purest Oedipal story you could ever have. And I was just thinking about that, and you know, I remember that like one of the things, my greatest joy as a child was me and my brother playing Mario in a very broken home, like a fucking really broken home. Just kind of freestyling here based on sort of like what was coming up for me. I mean, so much interesting things were said. I loved what Jockin said about religion and trust. Like if you need religion to have trust, then we have a big problem. And at the same time, I think was also being discussed was this idea that the image cannot just be deconstructed. You have to tarry with the negativity. And I think for me, like, why am I buying Mario games? Is because I cannot let go of the pain. I cannot let go of the pain. Like I literally messaged Daniel before coming on the net. I said I can't let go of the pain of basically what I perceive what my mom did. Like the pain is so fucking deep. And I can't fucking let go, man. But like Javier's pointing out, right? Like you come to the point where like there's no end, right? It's a spurious here. Like it's never gonna end. Like I can't get out of it. I can't fucking get out of it, man. So I'm asking myself, should I go back to psychoanalysis? Should I actually go back as a not teaching it, but I need to go back. Because the first time I went to psychoanalysis, it was because of my third girlfriend breaking up with me. And the image I was struggling with was that image. And then the second time I went to analysis was because of my relationship with my PhD supervisor, and it was this image of the father. So these image and so both of those times I worked through those in analysis. Like, do I need to go back to analysis? Because I have this perception that my mom betrayed me and I can't get rid of it, and that's why I'm buying Mario games. Because I can't deal with the pain of that. I don't know, man. I have other thoughts, but I'm gonna maybe leave it there.
That was excellent, and I hope Haven overheard all the Mario games because he's on cloud 9. He's like, Cadell likes Mario too. Yes, that's outstanding. And I now want to go back and fight Scott Brown in Street Fighter and Tekken because I'm back sneaking over to the neighbor's house. Well done. I think also what you're at. So a few things. One, again, when religion was more so part of society, whatever that means, the notion of going back to analysis or regular analysis was integrated into the structure, especially if it had a confessional structure or it had small groups. These things were more part of it. Not always. I can certainly tell you many churches did not have that function. But what we have here in the modernity is a lack of some sort of regular place of tarrying and working through those kind of questions. And I think that's massive. I think it's a massive loss. And what would it look like to regain that? I think is big because there is something that feels spurious. Does it just go on and on and on? And does one have to just live with the going on? Is there a way? And then I'll pass it on to Javier. On this question of the relation of Lovecraft and Dante, this is where I try to thank Flannery O'Connor so much. Because in Flannery O'Connor, grace is always violent. Like the only way that God can reach you is basically through a guy who shoots you, a bull that stabs you, or an incredible tragic loss. Like the only way to Dante is through the violence. Because what she's arguing is she's like, if human beings are like entrapped in sin or entrapped in irony or however we want to word this, then the only way God reaches them is through piercing, some sort of violent act. And so there's something about Flannery O'Connor that has to be thought for me, and it also brings to mind the extraordinary novel Bridge Over the Drina by Alvo Andrich on the character of Fatima, that I'll abstain from a minute.
There's something that has not, what Flannery O'Connor is trying to point at in her work is this question of the relation of Lovecraft and Dante that has to be thought. And again, the problem with Dante interpretations is that we either just talk about the Inferno, we never talk about the Purgatorio, dang it, or we just talk about the Paradiso, when the Commedia for Dante is indivisible. It all goes together. And if you don't see it as all together, one, you can't get the theme that Mr. Luber has left. I was going to touch, and you can't see how the only way to work toward beauty is through a process of wounding. The only thing that frees you is a wound, in a way. That's another point of Flannery O'Connor. It is like what breaks you is some kind of wounding. Tocqueville talks about doubt. Flannery O'Connor is like, you have to be broken. You're now free. There's a weird thing where in the act of being hurt, you realize that you're distinct from the world because it hurt you. So there's a thing there that can break you. And so the revelation of freedom comes in a pain. Well, that sucks. And then does that doom you to something spurious? What is the relation between the pain and the Dante, et cetera, so forth? I very much appreciate what you said. Let me pass it to Javier and then Chiton. And then alas, I'll have to go in about 25 minutes. But let me pass, this has been divine. Let me pass it to Javier and then Chiton.
Yeah, I mean, this is, very close to home and topic I've always struggled with. And it's funny because when Cadell talks about like Mario and the Oedipal story, I feel like mine is very similar to like a Hamlet kind of story. Like I just realized that my father has been the scapegoat for this entire family. Like my mother literally said yesterday, she's like, because she saw the fractured, of all of our relationships. She was like, I'm sorry, I hate saying this, but it's because of your father. And like, there was part of me that was like, I don't think we can even say that anymore. I don't think we can say that anymore. We can't say that anymore. I was like, I don't think we can say that anymore. And I was like, and what's more painful is that what's more painful is that the scapegoat is not even an adequate scapegoat. My dad has Parkinson's. When I see him, I just get increasingly sad because you just feel like you're just beating a helpless man, like the Parkinson's is punishment enough. Like there's nothing you could do. And yet, so angry, so upset, all those emotions, you're like, I don't know what to do with this. But Jockin said something about trust. Like if you have to have trust to be in a religion, like then religion's not worth it, something like that. I totally agree. And Buber says something very fascinating here, because Cadell brought up the spurious nature of postmodern thinking as well. And I feel like we're running into two types of problems. One is that there's still this haunting paradigm of modernity, of certainty. And then there's the other element, which is the spurious nature of postmodern thinking. But the real thing is, nobody's been able to return to that original thing. And Buber kind of addresses this with like, when you come from a tradition, you feel comforted because it's certain. But then when you leave a tradition, you're able to leave it because you're thinking and you're doubting. But the problem with thinking and doubting is that you are very vulnerable to spurious negativity. And then the other problem with being certain in a tradition, and I forgot how he frames it, is like you're not able to really respond for yourself. And so he's talking about how it wasn't called God of, it wasn't, how did he say it? He said it wasn't called God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He goes, it's called God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. And the reason why I interpret it this way is because we need to make a return back into our own way, like back to where we started. And I feel like postmodern thinking, well, I mean, there's a lot of problems. I don't want to give it like a caricature, but I'll put it this way. Most people just have a caricature of postmodern thinking. The laymen do anyways. The real postmodern philosophers actually gave a method to deal with this, but that's lost. So it's just as good as nothing, basically, because our whole world is structured on a fundamental reduction of postmodern thinking, which is my truth is relative to yours. That's it. There has nothing. It has gone nothing beyond that. It has completely fallen on deaf ears what the rest of postmodern philosophers have actually been saying. But regardless, we are still left with the fact that now there was this era of certainty. Now there's this era of just increasing spurious nature of relative truth, which nobody can handle because it feels like you're denying their difference. But that is not true, because in the moment of denying their difference, they don't understand that they are denying yours, right? That we obfuscate each other the moment we try to protect our difference. So this is the same thing, right? I'm just wounds become swords, and we're just wielding and slaughtering each other with protecting our differences. So for me, it really comes down to this, like, I've been grappling with Christianity really hard, like really fucking hard. And like, I realize that I can't escape it, but I feel like I have to return back into it my own way. And that's the only way. Like, it's not going to be able to, it can't be like a blind acceptance of a new faith or a new denomination. It can't be that way. But then I can't be in this realm of just like my philosophical thinking either, because I'm succumbing to spurious emotions and thinking. So like, I need to make something my own, and that's what I'm here with you, Cadell, when you talk about like, I want to go back into psychoanalysis, but like, you know, there's this tradition, but then there's like the way I want to conduct things. So it's like, how do I make a Christianity for Javier again? That's the question that I'm left with. And so it would not be about how do I keep my difference or how do I keep my trust in a religion. It's how do I place myself in there? And I think analogy of being is very important, which I've heard a lot of debates recently, and I'm still trying to grapple with that. There's been a lot of debates recently between dialectics and analogy of being, which is a whole nother wormhole I don't want to go into, but I'm very curious about this debate because I feel like there's a lot there in that debate. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Oh, you just said the three magic words. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Now, my beloved Austin Farrer, who never gets spoken of, like 50 years ago, was like, guys, we got to get through the analogy of being versus freaking dialectics conversation. Aquinas versus Karl Barth. Anyway, my fanboyism came out. I'm going to pass it to Chicha. One of the things I think is really profound, that I think is so important in the book of Revelation, is this notion that God's like, everyone will have a white rock that on the bottom of it has a name that only they know and that God knows. So there's a kind of God of Jacob, God of Isaac. It's not a, but there's an individuation that occurs with sort of a sharedness. It is this kind of God, but there's still a kind of uniqueness that is kind of contained in that. And it makes me think of dance. And also, I'll just like that kind of, it should also be noted, like when I talked with Cleo, what was so fascinating when she was talking with Derrida, and Derrida was like brought to tears in class because he realized, he was like, oh my gosh, like I'm leading all of these people astray into this kind of crazy relativism because no one's going to be reading my other books. And he felt really responsible for that. So that was pretty fascinating speaking with Cleo when she interacted with Derrida, because he's like, they're trapped in an endless deferral. And he's like, but wait. And there's something that, it was quite moving when she was talking about Cleo, when Cleo was talking about that. And I think the thing that you're getting at, like, we're stuck in a relativism when there is a third way, if you will, of this possibility of the white rock or the dance or this Javier's Christianity. Well, it's not Javier's random religion. It's Javier's Christianity. And actually, I think there's a precedent for that when you get into Paul. But that would get me into like methodologies and the analogy of being. But let me give it to Chetan, and then we have 15 more minutes for any final thoughts. I've enjoyed this immensely. You were all beautiful. But Chetan, please.
Thanks. Wonderful conversation, actually. One of the things that I sort of think about and struggle with when I sort of do my own research work is that how communities grieve. there is something about grief in that sense that that when you enter into a community and you try and understand, you be with it, it's only when you sort of submit yourself to moments when there is sadness sort of in the air, that you actually get to know a community, that you get to experience it, that you get to in that sense. And grief is a very interesting thing, as Cadell was sort of pointing out. The sadness that we all carry with ourselves. In many ways, other emotions that we talk about are a way and a means to escape our own deep sadness that and points of pain that we carry for ourselves, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I think we overlook over here is the role of aggression into this space. And we forget that a lot of our aggression is, of course, going outward, but there's a large part of it that goes inward back to us also. There's a large part of ourselves which is very angry with our own selves. And emotions are very interesting because emotions can hide one within the other. You can be consciously feeling one thing, and within it some other emotion is dominant one, and when you get to it, something else sort of comes out of the closet, which is why feelings and emotions aren't the same thing. For these feelings, you can be reasonably sure what you're feeling. What your emotions are is a completely different thing. Feelings lie in that sense, at all points of time. And there is something about this problem of inhabiting grief, not just feeling it in that sense. Because feeling it is a transitory, and you can again find ways of escape. But at what ways can we inhabit grief, inhabit sadness, such that we can recreate our boundaries between self and the other? Because that is what is at stake in this. When sadness is experienced, when sadness is touched upon, it's not simply that you are sad in that sense. What you're essentially doing is you're recreating the we-ness around you, the we feeling, you may call it, the we. I like this word. Doris Lessing used to use it. The we feeling, she used to call it. You recreate the boundaries of the commons, the communal, the through modes of sadness. And I don't think as a community, as a culture, we have started talking about, sadness in any real way for various reasons in that sense. We are still in that way a very primitive society, probably. We don't realize it, but some other culture will look at us and will probably think of us as like, really, what were they doing? They didn't even know how to sit with emotion for. And if you're honest to yourself and you sit with any emotion for a while, you would be staring into the abyss, as Nietzsche would say it. You would very, very, very early, very quickly reach to a point of, this complete blankness, and we are trying to find certainty in ground within that reality that the abyss is just right next to us at all points of time, and I think the struggle, working through it, in some senses, is a struggle of thinking about, some senses relationship in symbolic and the imaginary that we've sort of, talking about, and if we ask our this question honestly, we do not yet understand what role, in some sense, despite Lacan's great sort of works on this, what role the imaginary plays within the domain of our emotions and feelings. I don't think we have a very clear way to think that question of imagination in that sense within the realm of symbolic. How do we, as Cadell said, how do we give speech to something? At what point something erupts in speech, and what point something escapes it? At what point the speech gets the legitimacy of the other, and at what point speech completely collapses into its own, pressures? And yeah, I think, thanks.
That was stunning. I will pass it to Cadell. I really agree strongly with this
notion of we've really not dealt with sadness, and I like that distinction between emotion and feeling, and that's very useful. And there is something about sitting in pain that we don't know how to do. There's something about communal grief, and it almost is like we've avoided that by individuating grief and then medicating it, even, you know, turning it into something like when I hear like a Julie Ress emphasizing like residing in negativity and not being over therapeutic, it is this kind of let us not treat negativity as something that can be individuated and thus stuffed into a closet. You know, let us face it communal. And there seems to be, like, again, if we've mentioned Christianity, there's this weird long tradition where the moment you think that you're out of sin, you're now a devil, basically. Like a saint always, though, a saint never thinks of themselves as a saint. Well, what the heck does that mean? How do you do that? You got to like self-deceive yourself? What is the like conditioning of the subject that is capable of doing something like that? Which goes to mythology of, say, not looking at water while you walk on it, of not looking behind, you know, Lot turning his wife to salt, the Ulysses putting the wax in his ears. There's all of this mythology of doing something very strange that seems to be necessary for dealing with all of this. That seems very difficult to think, and we have not thought it. And I really appreciate those thoughts. I will pass it on to Cadell. And like I said, 10 more minutes if anyone has final things to say. Cadell, please.
I love what Javier is saying about we obfuscate each other the moment we try to protect our difference. And I've also been struggling with that fundamentally, that problem around this idea of a saint never thinks of himself as a saint. Like one of the things that I struggle with the most is this dimension of people who think they're saints. Because I guess, yeah, I mean, I don't know where I'm going to connect that, but I also like this idea of sadness that we carry with us, this deep sadness. And I'm holding this, like I feel like I'm holding this deep sadness right now. Like, for example, just give an example, like how this deep sadness comes up. And like, to me, Xmas, like Christmas is extremely this deep sadness, at least for me, because because Christmas is the opposite of a deep sadness when you're a child, but I don't have a child, so I feel like, and I'm in like a sort of a childless family situation in both my side of the family and on my partner's side of the family. So like, you know, and we just both sort of just deeply fundamentally struggle with that. Like I give an example, like weird things that are difficult to like articulate is we spent Christmas this year with her side of the family, and both of her parents are deaf and they only can use sign language. So it's fundamentally difficult for her and them to communicate their emotions because she was raised by parents who only could use sign language, and they were neglectful of communicating, you just restricted in that sense, or they were restricted in that sense, you know, and so she has struggled communicating emotions in that sense. And at the same time, being in that, enduring that negativity, we actually said to each other, like we were able to express to each other that we want to be together for our whole life. That as I think Andrew Luber said, trust becomes a fact. That somehow if you've been with each other, you've been through negativity with each other, trust just becomes a fact. It's just there. You feel that. And then I think it brings me to Daniel's democracy in trouble point, which I think is absolutely exact spot on, because that's what I've been talking about with techno-feudalism, is that basically techno-feudalism is a code for democracy and capitalism are divorced now. Totally divorced democracy and capitalism. And I think that to handle the trust anxiety issue, to resolve democracy, we need to go to the ground of the libidinal economy with polyamory and monogamy as these mirrors for the container that we're talking about with postmodernism and the truth. And I feel like this is at the core of what Emilio's talking about with these friends who use an optimized Tinder profile. With these optimized Tinder profiles, this is basically treating the other as your masturbation. And I think it's because the trust and anxiety, to me, in polyamory, the trust and the anxiety is absolutely unmanageable without doing that. You can't be super polyamorous without sort of doing that. At least to me, maybe there are people who can do do that, but but I don't know. I don't think so. At least for me, I'm like, for me, when I became monogamous, trust and anxiety, it's to me, monogamy and trust and anxiety manageability are connected. And then what you do with the masturbatory fantasies is you just have to sublimate them. Like either like you've got masturbatory fantasies and you sublimate them. And to me, the question is, could you sublimate them where? Into a family, into a business, into a career, what do? You put them into a family, you put them into and as best as you can. And to me, this is there's a paper that Alenka Zupancic wrote that she's going to be presenting next month. And I want her to talk about this because she's talking about sublimation. Can I read just a quote and then I'll shut up? I know. So let me just read a quote. This is from Alenka Zupancic, right? This is one of my favorite quotes from her. She says, Lacan's point is that when we enjoy writing poetry or talking about it, this enjoyment doesn't differ in any essential way from, say, enjoyment in sexual intercourse. And the point is not simply about abasement of intellectual activities. It is at least as much about elevating sexuality to a surprisingly intellectual activity. End quote. The point there is that we need to think about taking this energy and the sublimation of it. It's just to me, like if I say like away from all the ideology, like to me, what helped me get through my life has been basically something that looks a bit like sublation. And then what I connect sublation to is sublimation. It's just sublimate. So I'm just thinking about that. And we need to think sublimation for the digital economy. And I think for trust networks. And Daniel said, trust is the central thing. Trust is the central thing. And so here's I wanted to say one more thing. In my doctorate, I've had a side project of this guy's connected to the European Union who they're getting paid to do an app, which is to build a trust network. And so there were two guys. One guy, and these are still actual relationships, two guys. One guy is like a Euro tech guy, and the other guy is this physicist guy. And the Euro tech guy wants app solutions, and the physicist engineer guy just builds equations. And I was there just as this point of negativity, basically saying, I don't know if you guys are thinking about this properly. Like, I think you guys, like, basically, I was just negativity there. And so maybe also what Andrew Luber said and what Daniel's saying, it's about either the fear of death or is it the pain of experience? And so both the tech solutionism and the physicists, they won't think the pain of experience or death. I may be rambling, but that's it.
Magnificent. And everyone has said so much. I've enjoyed this immensely. You know, a few things come to mind. One of the worst things that Web 3.0 started talking about was how Bitcoin was trustless, because it was kind of a Freudian slip. Everyone wants to live in a trustless world, because that would be a world free of anxiety, wouldn't it? And so what we're actually looking for is not how to live with the problem of trust or anxiety, but actually how to escape it by creating trustless networks and different things. And one of the things I'll talk to people, you know, in that world is kind of like, well, no, how is it possible to use these technologies to create a platform where it is possible to form trust-based relationships with other people, right? Where you create sort of alternative mechanisms of economy so that people can relate them without the mediation of their jobs or business and wage labor or whatever, that actually helps them avoid the person because they're actually just dealing with the job title. Oh, well, that's no. Oh, gosh. Oh, no. We want to use this to like avoid the problem of trust and different things as opposed to leaning into it. And I think we really we make a big mistake if we think that the suspension of disbelief is the same as the presence of belief, or that trustless is the same as the presence of trust. Now, there's something to be said about the suspension of disbelief being necessary to meet someone, like in the dating phase. You know, it creates the opening, but it has to then move into something positive. It has to move into the absolute choice. It has to move into a container. One needs the experience of many containers to determine which container they will choose.
but one must not mistake the road with the destination. One must not mistake the exploring of possibility with the same thing as making a choice. One must not confuse trustlessness with trust. I think it's very interesting. You know, there's a bunch of things on this question of the relationship of, say, beauty, wound, residing in negativity, like dwelling in pain. There are these things that seem to relate and seem very, very important. One of the great problems with talking about Dante, which, as you know, is an example I use all the time, is that you know that he goes to Paradiso. The only way to really get Dante is to imagine being Inferno and not knowing you're coming out, which of course is now impossible because you know he comes out of it, right? One of the great problems is it's hard to take the Jesus story on the cross not knowing that he's going to be resurrected. One of the great problems is that all of these stories kind of pointing to this sort of this necessary dwelling in pain is knowing the ending of ahead of time and thus not being able to really emotionally and deeply get what's being talked about. You can only truly dwell in negativity in really, really dwelling in negativity. But then, of course, the problem is if you say, well, if I dwell in negativity, then I'm going to end up in Inferno, but then you're not dwelling in negativity, and then you're looking for a guarantee. So the mystery is Dante, not Lovecraft. How in the world do you balance this seemingly contradiction? It's the problem of being a saint and not knowing it, because you cannot truly dwell in pain if you dwell in pain thinking that if I dwell in pain, it's going to turn into something. And yet you have these stories of dwelling in pain and only thinking you dwelling in pain, having the possibility of turning into something. And it's as if you must darken that possibility from yourself. Can you do that? Is that possible? Doesn't seem possible. So what's the best alternative? It seems as if to dwell in pain is to always be willing to face the other. When you dwell in pain, that means you know what the other can do to hurt you, but the positive action is the stepping into the places of possible anxiety, stepping into the places of possible vulnerability. And that's how you dwell in pain in an active way that is constantly confronting you with something that you are having to choose, that is the opening of the possibility of relating to the mystery, because you don't know what will happen, because you never know what the other person is going to do. And it's as if it is only in the encountering of the other that you can find a way to deal with this paradox of dwelling in negativity without the guarantee of paradisio, because you never know what's going to happen with the other. So it would seem as if the issue of dwelling in negativity without guarantee is tied to the ever willingness to be with the other, which of course would be the being with anxiety, which we've never done as a collective. This is not something we have thought, but the dwelling in pain is tied to the willingness to face anxiety, which is never guaranteed. And it would seem that these are the things that go together, because the moment we start talking about dwelling in pain as the willingness to face other, which we know is not guaranteed, it would seem that we can understand how you can have this notion of Inferno leading to the beauty, or the mystery having the Lovecraft, and actually doing something, acting, even though there is not a guarantee. And that absolute choice of the other, and this is why so much comes down to the ability to deal with the real of people and conditioning ourselves to doing that kind of thing. And that's why, for me, like the dwelling in negativity, the image that, Resh uses is the hospice. The hospice is lovely because a hospice is a place with people. There are relations there that you are encountering that has a certain anxiety. And that seems to be what we have to be willing to be in, because there's a certain quality of beauty that is possible in a hospice, in a cross, between two people that have aged for a long time together and dwelled in sadness, that turns the relationship mysteriously into something like a fact, even though it's not a fact, and yet it has the quality of fact. It's basically a kind of transubstantiation, a changing of water into wine. Something that is not a fact becomes a fact. It's a kind of miracle. That kind of miraculous is only possible in the dwelling of the pain, because it is only the wound that can function as an opening to the possibility of beauty. And in the same way that beauty is infinite, so the wound is infinite, but the infinity of the wound is precisely the possibility to have ever capacity for more of that beauty, which is piercing. And that means it hurts, but because it hurts, it is evidence that we are alive. So the question is, how may we get better to face and deal and live with others in a meaningful way and dwell in that possible pain without those guarantees and make those absolute choices? Well, that's going to take work, and I'm glad to be here so that we can work through that work. It's been a pleasure, my friends. Thank you so much for your time. It is always a delight.
That was the sermon of Vermont.
Sherman of Vermont. Absolutely. It's a pleasure, friends. Thank you so much.